Looking for a new spin on laundry? Ask us about our new mobile payment option.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Fred Rosen, and I'm the president and founder of Spectrum Building Services. Spectrum is proud to support the PM Springfest educational series. It is my pleasure to open today's panel discussion, Considerations for Indoor Air Quality, IAQ, as an index of building performance. You know, Spectrum Building Services has been servicing the condominium and multi-residential housing market for 30 years. Spectrum provides carpet cleaning, emergency 24-hour a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year, flood, trauma, and fire cleanup service, runner programs, and a commitment to indoor air quality by offering IICRC certified mold remediation, air testing, and a full BioClean program for our clients. Please visit our virtual booth and learn about the Spectrum Advantage and get an opportunity to meet some of our Spectrum superheroes. In addition, you'll be eligible to win a DoorDash gift certificate. Now, before we start, I'd like to remind everybody to get comfortable in their seat and settle in. Please use the chat function to connect with the people in this session. And now I'd really like to introduce Susan Allen, who is the president and CEO of BOMA Toronto, who will introduce the session. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Susan Allen.
Thank you, Fred. On behalf of BOMA Toronto, I would like to welcome you all to PM Springfest. Today's session will be a candid conversation with industry leaders on their approach to tackling the challenges of indoor air quality as property managers and owners alike address indoor air quality strategies in building operations, especially under current pandemic conditions, and our need to be better prepared for any future public health crisis. I am pleased to introduce our moderator, Philippe Bernier. Philippe is the Vice President, Strategy, Operations and Sustainability at JLL Canada. He is responsible for advancing strategy, innovation, sustainability, and ensuring operational effectiveness and accelerating JLL's market growth. Philippe spent a decade in management consulting and manufacturing roles, supporting teams and clients to improve systems and processes, adopt new technologies, strengthen leadership reputations, create an innovative governance structure, and establish a national and international reputation for ESG leadership. Please join me in welcoming Philippe Bernier.
Hello, welcome. My name is Philippe Bernier. I am thrilled to have you here for today's conversation about considerations regarding indoor air quality and the potential value of an indoor air quality or IAQ index. We have a phenomenal panel with us today and very much look forward to getting into the conversation. But before we do, I would like to start with a question. What's your guess? Over the course of your life, how many of the breaths you take will be taken indoors? Do you think it's a small handful? Is it 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 out of 10? Get the answer in your head. How many of our breaths do we take indoors? If you guessed 9 out of 10, you would be correct. Indoor air quality is incredibly important. We can go for weeks without food, days without water, but literally only minutes without breath. What we've discovered through recent research, for example, out of the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, good air quality reduces sick days, it increases productivity. It can even increase by hundreds of % our ability to analyze problems and come up with good solutions. The other trick with indoor air quality, I think we can all realize it, is we're kind of like a fish in water. We don't realize that we're breathing microscopic particles all the time, and it's hard to see what we're actually breathing. Is it good? Is it bad? how might we know? And also, if we were to really work hard to just provide tons of good fresh air all the time, there are trade-offs with energy and carbon. So what might be the right way forward? Is it an index or otherwise? This is what we're here to find out. In today's session, our purpose is to discuss the importance of indoor air quality, how it's measured today, and how leading buildings deliver excellent indoor air quality without sacrificing energy and emissions performance. We're also going to debate the value of an industry-wide IAQ index, what might be its underlying components, and how a standard index could further building operations excellence. Lastly, we're going to explore how it, as a trend, might continue based on market regulatory and technological changes. And for us, your panel, we hope that success will look like this for you, that you will commit to learn more about indoor air quality after we're done today, and that you will be able to advance an understanding of IAQ best practices and their application in the areas of influence that you control. Now, reminder, please use the QA chat box functionality. It's on all the time. Our panel, we're monitoring the chat feed live and are going to answer any questions you have throughout the conversation. And if there are any questions that are left unaddressed after these remarks, we are all going to be brought together into a live chat room following the discussion. So with that, I look forward to introducing you to Arv, Brandon, and Marlene. Arv is National Operations Lead for Cadillac Fairview. Brandon, Operations Director and Projects at Bentel Greenhow, and Marlene Fire is Senior Vice President of Property Management in the Central Region with Trivas Realty Advisors. So now let's go to our panelists. Arv, Brandon, Marlene, welcome. It's great to have you here today. And I'm hoping, as we start this conversation, that we might begin with just a lightning fire round. If you can reflect on the past year, what's the one new thing that you've learned about indoor air quality that you didn't previously know? Maybe, Arv, starting with you.
Okay, yeah, so for a quick response, I'll start by saying that indoor air quality has so many components and aspects that are important, that they're generally focused on both comfort and health. Now, on the health side of things, it was generally known that poor air quality can be bad for your health, but this adverse impact is really something that happens over time. And it can also lead to, as you said, poor productivity. But I think since COVID, we realized that this health impact can be more immediate. I don't think we really thought too much about virus transmission, for example, as a potential, and the immediacy of that health impact. So I'd say that that's probably something that we've learned.
Thanks, Arv. Brandon, how about you? What's the one new thing you've learned over the past year about IAQ?
Perhaps not a learning, but more so a rediscovering is how little we know about indoor air quality, about the various things that we measure, we try to measure, and what they mean to our health.
Thanks, Brandon. And Marlene, how about you? What did you learn over this past remarkable year that we've all lived through about indoor air quality?
So for me, Philippe, has been the importance of indoor air quality in correlation with human health. The building affects our health with relation to ventilation, filtration, humidification. Notwithstanding the progress that we've done in the industry from the sick building syndrome era, COVID has really accelerated the industry approach on how we look at air quality from a building perspective. I really believe that air quality in healthy buildings is really a layer approach where we need to really look at all those variables that really impact our air quality. And really, we need to develop a systematic approach on how to deal with air quality.
Thank you all very much. So we've been learning some new things about IAQ over the past year, building on what we've learned to date. And now let's really dive into it. So over the next 20-25 minutes, we're going to explore in order, what are the standards? How do we measure indoor air quality? And what might be the value of the index? So we're going to start, Arv, with you. You oversee national operations across the Cadillac Fairview Corporation's sizable real estate portfolio. Could you help us understand, are there standards for indoor air quality? What are they and what do they cover?
Yeah, for sure, Philippe. There's definitely standards related to indoor air quality. They were there before COVID, and certainly there's even more awareness of them following COVID. So, basically there are three main areas that standards focus on. First, the level of CO2 or carbon dioxide in the air. Number two, the presence of unwanted indoor air particulates. Think of what you might be breathing in at a construction site, for example, right? And third, the total level of volatile organic compounds. People refer to them as VOCs. This could be anything from the smell of a magic marker that you might breathe in, or paint or varnish on furniture, things like that. These are really the main things that we test for. And now, the guidance for these standards and what the acceptable levels are really comes from recognized industry associations. Things like, associations like LEED, BOMA, ASHRAE. And, at CF, we try to meet all these standards on all of these components. And I'd say we also, as you mentioned earlier, we're also trying to make sure there's enough fresh air coming into the buildings as well.
So would it, why were the standards created in the first place?
Yeah, no, good question. I mean, the bottom line is that air quality is directly linked, as you said earlier, to our health. It's pretty obvious that the air that we breathe can impact our health. However, the reality is that the impact is not necessarily immediately noticeable. And as I said earlier, it may show up over time or lead to a deterioration in occupant productivity. It was also mentioned earlier that we all spend an enormous time indoors, and we need to manage the quality of this air that we breathe. Look, at the end of the day, for me as in CF, we're landlords and we rent space to our clients. Our clients need to ensure the comfort, safety, and productivity of their employees. So we have a responsibility to ensure that the quality of the air is healthy. Otherwise, we're not renting space to any clients. You might say we're not only renting space, but we're also renting the air that they breathe.
Marlene, it's clear that indoor air quality has some key standards, that the regulation of indoor air quality can be slightly different in different jurisdictions, and that there are some voluntary leadership principles that exist on how to do it well. Brandon, the voluntary building rating systems like BOMA Best and LEED, they touch upon indoor air quality. Could you help us understand how important indoor air quality is for some of these voluntary rating systems?
Certainly, and the rating systems have always treated indoor air quality, and some would call an indoor environmental quality, with the same prominence as other sections such as energy, water, materials, etc. And so it has consistently been a category or a key consideration in achieving LEED and BOMA Best certification, and WELL and FitWell even more so, because those two programs are focused on wellness and the health of building spaces. We found that, especially in the COVID context, that the buildings which have achieved one of those standards are in a better place when we're responding to questions about our indoor air quality, because we have the data and the information at our fingertips. Some items that we've talked about, or some strategies that we've discussed through COVID mitigation or viral mitigation strategies, include increased outdoor air, or at least verifiable outdoor air supply, improved filtration for air handling systems. And those are two components that are captured in all of those rating systems.
And Brandon, they're building on some of the initial voluntary rating systems, BOMA Best, LEED, WELL, and FitWell. We've seen some new rating systems emerge over the course of the pandemic, the WELL Health and Safety Rating, as well as the FitWell Viral Response Module. Have these recent rating systems provided some additional guidance on what else we might be thinking about as it relates to indoor air quality to reduce the risk, let's say, of infectious respiratory disease transmission?
Yeah, and they really build on what LEED, BOMA Best, FitWell, and WELL discuss in their rating systems, but they build on the sense that they're adding some additional strategies and some additional requirements, and they focus on two areas which I think are pretty unique and very important to this conversation. One is behavior change, and the second is building occupant trust. There are particular sections And that terminology that I've used is from the Fitwell viral response, but similar sections exist in WELL as well. There are particular questions and requirements to dictate behavior change and to talk about how we can, as landlords, improve that tenant-occupant trust relationship, especially in these uncertain times with indoor air quality and health of our buildings.
That's interesting. So beyond, of course, the physical, operational, or even system strategies that we can employ at the building, there are also things that we need to do in terms of how we communicate or how we might communicate performance as it relates to indoor air quality, and also encourage positive behavior from the people who live, work, play, and learn in our building. So it's a partnership approach. And there's arguably, to do this well, it takes a team. Marlene, do you have anything else to add just as we reflect on IAQ standards before we move on? And I'll ask Arv the same question, but is there anything else that you can think of that we haven't touched upon yet as it relates to standards?
No, there's a guide from the Health Agency of Canada that really talks about IAQ through COVID. So there are, again, a number of guides out there that we can touch upon and draw some of those standards to apply them at the building level.
Excellent. And Arv, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're just going to continue to learn, and the standards will continue to evolve, So I think that's really the obvious point.
Great. And Brandon, was there anything else that you care to add from a standards perspective that we haven't touched on?
Yeah, I think the standards discussion is an important one. And another indoor air quality issue, which we haven't talked about today, and we may not talk about again, is radon. Radon is certainly a human health challenge that we have in Canada, in some regions in Canada more than others. And this is not yet regulated. We're not as landlords required to perform radon testing. And if we do perform radon testing, there is a duty of care to then do something about it. So for landlords, and I don't expect anyone on this panel, there may be an inclination not to do testing because you can claim ignorance, which I think is a problem. And I think we have to look at these standards and see where those gaps, and I would argue radon is one of those gaps, where there's not a requirement to do the testing, therefore people aren't doing it because they're afraid of the results.
And Brandon, a naive question, just to make sure I understand and the audience understands. If I recall correctly, radon is a gas that tends to exist in some of our Canadian kind of granite bedrock. It's a radioactive gas that can you just help us understand what radon is and where we might find it in Canada?
Well, I'm not an expert, aside from having done radon testing in both my home and the office buildings where I work. And you're right that it is a radioactive gas that decays over time and tends to be pulled in through cracks in areas of basements in office buildings and homes. It exists in the granite and the Canadian Shield, and is the second leading cause of lung cancer in Canada. So it's something that we don't talk about, in my opinion, nearly enough. And but one of the reasons is that if there's not a standard in place, there is a guideline. Health Canada has a guideline, WHO has a guideline, but we don't have a standard to dictate how to test for it, the frequency of testing, and then what that if you hit a certain number, a certain concentration, what you need to do about it.
Interesting. So we've covered a lot of ground in terms of standards. There are standards, some are to different degrees regulated, and there's certainly a duty of care. If we're to go beyond standards into measurement, maybe Arv, I could turn back to you. What exactly, we touched upon this a bit, could we get into a bit more like, what are we actually measuring? Like, is it one thing, 3 things, 100 things? Like, what kind of things can we measure in our air?
Yeah, no, great question. It's interesting, the conversation about radon. We can really end up boiling the ocean and measure everything there is, but we could still have an adverse event. And so the key here is really to stay informed on the latest thinking from the industry associations, and even some of this recent wellness certifications that we talked about, well and fitness. They've also started to provide guidance from medical communities. So we really have to stay on top of this advice, as I feel that this area will continue to evolve. But at the end of the day, the three core base things aren't going to change. The CO2 levels, indoor air particulates, and VOC levels. I think those are the base, and the rest will continue to evolve.
Interesting. And then how might we, like, are there specific tools or technologies at a high level? Like, how do we actually measure these different components of air? Is it like some specialized equipment? What kinds of devices?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'm not the expert on tools and technologies, but perhaps, some of the other panelists may have some other comments later on. But what I do know is that there are sensors, essentially, that are used to detect the components that are being they're tested in the air. And so now at CF, we generally contract this testing out to independent third parties, and they will use various sensors to detect the element that they're looking for in the air.
Neat. And like where, so it might be contracted out, I suppose, with some degree of, some colleagues with some technical training and how to use the equipment. You could do it yourself. Where do we test the air? Like, is it just in one spot, or like where do we actually test the air in a building?
Well, the simple answer here is wherever people are likely to breathe the air. That's where you want to test, right? And so the reality is the standards themselves have very clear guidance on methodology for testing in most cases. And generally for us, we're testing on every floor, in multiple locations, and in all the common spaces as well. And each standard, as I said, has their own methodology for testing. For example, well certification is very clear and very stringent on the testing procedures.
And if you were to add, has anything changed to your knowledge over the course of the past year through the pandemic in terms of what might be kind of standard or kind of best practice as it relates to indoor air quality measurement? Has something changed?
Yeah, I know, it's a good question. I mean, I guess the stakes have really changed in some ways, right? As I mentioned earlier, it's the immediacy of the risk from a health component that just seems to be higher. And, truthfully, we're also having conversations now about potentially needing to increase the frequency of testing. But I guess what's really changed is that I feel like there's greater interest from our clients and the community at large to find, to be more informed. And so we have to find the right way to keep our clients informed of the measurements, informed of the results, because we need to maintain their confidence level. So at the end of the day, it's about the communication of this and the awareness that seems to be changed.
Interesting. And that parallels, Brandon, what you were sharing earlier, the importance of communication and building trust, in addition to, of course, measuring. So let's stay on the measuring theme for a moment. And I would like to do a quick lightning round with each of you. If you had only one thing, or you've listed three things, if you could only measure one thing as your proxy for indoor air quality, what would it be? And we'll do this rapid fire, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to get you to explain why. But just what's the one thing? That's the first question. So starting maybe reverse order, Marlene, what's the one thing you would measure if you could just measure one thing?
I would do two things. Humidity, just because of the ASHRAE standards on aerosolization, and the CO2 levels, right? Looking at filtration, the distribution, and ventilation control.
Interesting. So RH, relative humidity, and CO2. Brandon, what would you measure? And we'll come back and we'll get really into why we think these are important. But Brandon, what would you measure?
I'd measure the actual outdoor air flow rate in our spaces.
Actual outdoor air flow rate. Interesting. Arv, how about you? What would you measure?
Tough question. I agree with the others, but if you had to nail me on one thing, maybe I'll give you a non-traditional answer and say occupant productivity.
Interesting. So, yeah, I like these indirect ways. This is interesting. Occupant productivity, as well as some particularly important. So maybe Marlene, coming back to you again, anything else to add in terms of why CO2 and relative humidity are particularly important in your mind as things to measure as a proxy for indoor air quality?
Right. So I do go back to ASHRAE's position on infectious aerosol and really follow their recommendations for the management and strategies on air. I also look at the CDC guidelines on IAQ and like I mentioned before, the Public Health Agency of Canada guidelines on IAQ. There are some studies that show that relative humidity is important to limiting the spread of the viruses. The recommended level is between 40 to 60%. But I'll revert back to the humidity level because we've done some testing internally at Trio of Us, and I know the government of Canada has done some testing through the winter season, so I'll touch on that. But going back to CO2 testing, there's a recent paper from the Colorado University and the Cooperative Institute of Science that reports that any indoor setting, when excess CO2 levels double, the risk of the viral transmission also doubles. So I think CO2 is very important. Now, tracking CO2, like Gaurav said, it's very inexpensive. We do it every 2 years, and it's a really good way of mitigating risk. But going back to touching on relative humidity, we've done a test in the government of Canada, and their government buildings in Ottawa have done a test through the winter season. And their systems doesn't reach 40%. The max that they reach was 25%. At Trio of Us, we've also tracked through the winter season, and we range between 20 and 30%. Just our systems are not designed to reach that 40% recommended by ASHRAE. So it'll be interesting to see, based on the data that we're seeing, whether ASHRAE changes and does an update to the guidelines that they've published with respect to COVID.
Thank you, Marlene. Interesting. Not too much, not too little, kind of just right humidity helps to seemingly mitigate viral transmission risk, and I suppose also reduce the risk of mold, which we don't want if you've got too much humidity.
That's right. You want to avoid condensation. And I think if you reach 60%, you do have a big risk of condensation, obviously.
Brandon, really quickly, why outdoor air flow rate?
Well, it's a consistent requirement across codes and LEED and well certification, that sort of thing. Like it is that one metric, bringing in the right amount of outdoor air per person. That's really that's driven home by all these things. I found that in our buildings, and perhaps it's just the systems I'm dealing with, that it's not very often that we have an actual airflow rate. We use a number of assumptions. We use damper position as a metric to determine outdoor airflow. We just don't have the actual amount of outdoor airflow rate. And I go back to learning about pollution and smokestacks back as a younger person, and a phrase that rings true as a solution to pollution is dilution. And if we can dilute all the pollutants in the air and kind of spit them back out into the atmosphere, I'm not talking about this from an environmental perspective, purely from an indoor air quality perspective, that is a good thing.
That was certainly, as an undergraduate civil engineer going through, that was an anecdote that was thrown around in the classroom, and to a degree, It's true. And we also want to reduce the potential pollutants at the first place too. But dilution is an important strategy. Arv, last word in terms of why, in your case, do you think it's so important to measure occupant productivity?
Listen, I said it was a non-traditional answer, right? So look, there's many things that impact occupant productivity, but there's been lots of studies that show air quality is one of the leading factors. So my hypothesis is really that if employee productivity is down, there's likely a high correlation to air quality. Of course, it's not the only aspect, and I don't know if it's the chicken or the egg, but the reality is there is a correlation between the two.
Neat. So it's clearly complicated. There's a lot of different things we can measure. And moving from standards to how we might measure indoor air quality, let's now shift to our third topic, which is an indoor air quality index. Arv, again, get you to lead this off. We've had in the industry now for actually, I guess, decades, an Energy Star score, for example, to simplify energy, 1 to 100 score, or RealPAC with their focus on like a 20 energy use intensity by 2015 target, or maybe a 15 by 20, as if Michael Brooks is listening right now. These kinds of ideas, it's neat to simplify. Is it possible to simplify something as complicated as indoor air quality, or like what problem might having an index solve? Could having an index help us solve some problems?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I have frankly mixed feelings about an index. At the end of the day, I guess an index really could become a simple vehicle to communicate the safety and quality of the air that the occupants are breathing. there's so many complex factors for indoor air quality that having one simple number or an index could be a simple way of just distilling the level of risk. However, like most things, it would take some time for people to build a base level of knowledge before these end users could interpret the results and interpret what does it mean for them from a risk level perspective.
So it might not be an immediate win if we were to have an index. It might take a bit of time. We're still, as an industry, I would suggest, learning in different quarters what the Energy Star 1 to 100 score is.
Right.
Who would be, if there was an index, who would benefit from it? Who would actually look to an index? Would it be the building automation system to trigger a decision? Would it be an occupant of the building to know whether they should step foot inside or out? Who do you think might benefit from an index if we had one?
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think it's all stakeholders, right? The occupant certainly will try to interpret that number to a risk level. What's my risk today? Is it high, low, or medium? And of course, building operators will do the same thing, except they are really going to have to diagnose where the issue is. So when they see a number, the number alone isn't going to tell them where the problem is. They're going to have to dig deeper. But it's an alert that there might be a problem. So I think everybody can use it. It'll just be used in different contexts.
Brandon, would you have anything to add in terms of why or why not an index could be helpful?
I think indoor air quality, more so even than energy, is more of a relationship between the tenant and the occupant and the landlord. We've talked about this with energy and the lose to win challenge. What was it called in Toronto? Oh, I forget the
Race
name.
to win?
Race to reduce.
Excuse me.
That's
race
it.
To reduce.
Yeah, so that was all about the occupant engagement. I think indoor air quality takes that to the next level, and something like an index is part of that toolbox that can help start the conversation. But I'm not sure it's enough. I think there needs to be another layer to it. If that is kind of that broad Energy Star type metric, that's fine. But to Arv's point, there's such a broad spectrum of metrics, and we're going to talk more about them, I think, over the next couple minutes. But there are a broad spectrum of metrics of VOCs and particulates and that sort of thing. It's hard to distill that down into a number. And throughout COVID, there have been a lot of numbers thrown about, and I think that we are all looking for what is the wise data, I like to call it. Not just the number, well, what's a number that has some wisdom associated with it that we can learn from? And so that would be my thoughts on an index. Yeah, sure, that gets the conversation started. We don't really have it now, but it's not enough.
Yeah, and are you aware anywhere in your travels, in what you've read of an index of sorts that might be applied for indoor air quality? Have you come across anything?
Yeah, there was one, and I was doing a bit of research on this, and this popped up, and I thought, of course, we see this every day, and Ontario has the Air Quality Health Index that they publish every hour for 40 plus or minus areas in the province, and that index measures pollutants such as ozone, particulates, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide. It measures, interesting enough, some parameters that we like to measure within our buildings, and it provides that index for people to, I think, decide. It has not affected my life and my lifestyle, but I think some people decide on if they're going to go outside during those hot summer days, and the index is on the high risk side of things. So that it's out there. Now, please don't ask me to speak to the methodology of coming up with their rating scale, because I frankly have just seen it. You see it on the Weather Network and that sort of thing. So that's one that's fairly well known, but not directly applicable to us. The other one that I've been using and playing with quite a bit is by a private company called Aware, and they developed an index that's a scale from 0 to 100. They score 5 indoor air quality parameters: temperature, humidity, carbon dioxide, chemicals, and fine dust. And based on how you're doing within different bands, different ranges within those different types of pollutants or those types of measurements, they give you a score out of 100. 100 being perfect indoor air quality, if you want to call it that, and 0 being you kind of want to get out of that room pretty fast. So those are the two that come to mind as indices that exist. I'm sure there are others out there, but those two kind of, in my mind, if you're going to build an index, that would be a place to start.
Neat. So one public, one private, and possibly proprietary. Definitely having some public standard, if there were to be an index, might have some value. Marlene, what have you seen in terms of prevalence of an index, or anything else you want to just add to the conversation about the value of an index, or not, if you don't think it's particularly valuable?
Well, I do agree with Brandon in the IAQ index for the city. I know China has a pretty extensive IAQ index where you can just click on a map and see where the air pollutant is pretty high, and you choose to either go out or wear a mask, etc. But I do know that the Lawrence Berkeley Lab is a national research department for the energy department of the US. They're looking at coming up with a scorecard on IAQ, similar to the HERS index, which is the home energy rating system. So they are working on something. It's more geared towards residential, but I think they're onto something. And so we need to kind of keep an eye on that Lawrence Berkeley Lab program that they're developing.
Excellent. And I had a quick back and forth conversation. As some of the listeners might know, a fellow by the name of Chris Pike is fairly senior in the U.S. Green Building Council. Chris has also done quite a bit of work on air quality, and he was sharing that there is a cross-sectoral academic public sector initiative called, I think it's called airnow.gov, where you can, similar to Ontario, you can search your zip code in the U.S. and get an understanding of what's the air quality right now and where's it trending. So there's some good work being done, and one of the tricks might be, if this is valuable, how might we adapt these public methodologies into a building level, and what kinds of technologies would we use to measure it, and who needs this feedback to ideally make some better decisions or actions. Before we move out of standards and measurement and index and start getting into how we deliver good quality air, does anyone have anything else to add?
I just want to pick up on a couple of comments here. You know, I said earlier I had mixed feelings about it, about an index, and in some ways I think we should really simply have a pass or fail versus a gradient for air quality. I mean, how do you interpret a difference between a 65 or a 75? You know, which one is safer? And honestly, I'm not sure that as landlords we want to get into this business of advertising a gold or platinum level of air quality. You know, in some ways it's either risk-free or it's not. You know, it's either safe to be there or it's not safe to be there. And so I think consumers will have a tough time interpreting a single number. And, you know, it kind of reminds me, we're talking about smog, it reminds me of in the 90s, we used to talk about the smog days. And but at the end of the day, people just wanted to know, is it safe for me to be out or not? And this idea of a gradient is really tough. So anyway, that's my thoughts.
And I agree with you. I think it's, reporting the air quality, the interpretation of what exactly is at a highest level for a tenant. And if there's no regulation out there and we're just coming up with a standard, it could be interpreted from one scale to the next, right? And we could have some risks there.
So maybe just quite simply, some standards align. Restaurant, for example, Toronto Green Pass, and you're good to go. And curious, Marlene. So now shifting out of index, what might be some operational or capital strategies that we can adopt to guarantee or certainly contribute to better indoor air quality? Could you share with us your thinking in terms of maybe what you and I had discussed, a layered approach? What do you mean by a layered approach?
So in my view, a layered approach to air quality, there's so many variables that really affect air quality. Like we've talked, radon, mold, VOCs, etc. So you really need to have a layer approach on exactly how do you get to that good air quality kind of threshold. Looking at ventilation improvements should be assessed and considered as part of the ongoing maintenance and capital improvements. Looking at demand ventilation, perhaps at some buildings where you are looking at doing some capital improvements to the HVAC system, putting in some CO2 sensors, communication sensors, looking at filtration. Some buildings have legacy systems, and we can install MERV 13. What do we need to do to get us to that level where we can get some really good filtration for our buildings? Really understanding the building performance, partnering up with some base building engineers to really complete a pandemic IAQ review and looking at ventilation rates, similar to what Brandon was talking about. Looking at energy management as well. That's a big component. ASHRAE is asking us to open dampers in the morning, but that really puts a damper on our energy management strategies. How do we manage energy and yet open those air dampers so that we can flush the systems? IAQ testing, we talked about doing some IAQ testing. Is very inexpensive, but it gives us some indications of where our contaminants are at a building level. We're looking at technology as well. We're looking at measuring beyond ASHRAE comfort parameters, looking at VOCs, looking at radon, and touching on what Brandon said before. Pynchon is really promoting right now at some downtown buildings to really get into this radon testing. It's a big concern, and we need to start looking at how do we measure. But going back to what Brandon said, what do we do with that information once we do get those measuring thresholds, and how do we put measures in place from a mechanical perspective so that we can mitigate those risks? Looking at real-time reading through fall detection smart systems. We're testing some real-time IAQ components from a technology perspective and seeing what those readings are. Bacterial risk. Also, we know that there's transmission through aerosols, and we need to be aware of the bacteria transmission. You need to think about, testing water, Legionella with respect to cooling towers, ATP testing of common areas, looking at touch points, looking at tenant spaces, asbestos and mold where required. We should be considering those testing as well. And then lastly for us is really the Clean and Safe program, cleaning beyond just cleaning and cleaning for health, and following standards of the ISS Industry Association in the US. So that's what I mean from a layer approach, Philippe. It's really looking at all those components that impact air quality and demonstrating to the tenants that we have a proactive approach from an air quality perspective.
Fantastic. So we stretch quite far beyond the proximate risks of viral transmission. There are many, many, many important considerations when working to ensure highest possible quality of air. Then we've got the trade-off with energy and emissions, because we could just flood the building with fresh air, but that would necessitate a lot of energy and carbon. Have you, Marlene, maybe just really briefly, and then Brandon, I'll go to you. Marlene, could you briefly describe what like a best-in-class building might look like today that does phenomenally from an indoor air quality perspective and also sips energy and doesn't pollute a lot of carbon?
We have a building that we consider a smart building out in the suburbs in Mississauga. This building obviously has all the bells and whistles. It's a fairly new building. We have a heat pump system that has multi-zoned air dampers. So we're able to control CO2 humidity levels at each zone. So there's multiple zones on that floor, and we're able to shut down some zones where we don't need them, where it's unoccupied. And right now with COVID, we've been able to really leverage that technology to give us our maximum performance and energy savings. So, but again, is that technology is the new era of buildings. They're shiny, they're smart, and it gives us the tools that we need to really manage effectively.
Fantastic. Marlene, thank you. Brandon, based on what I understand, Bentall Green Oak, and you've been involved in a number of experiments as well to get deeper into measurement and quality improvements to indoor air. Could you share with the listeners today some of what you've been learning through these experiments and what's next?
Yeah, so building on what Marlene's answer just a moment ago with respect to carbon and emissions, one thing that we're starting to do is track our emissions real time. Now, this is not as per ISO or any sort of emissions reporting program, but we've been able to plot our emissions, our electricity based emissions based on the time of day, which comes into the indoor air quality piece importantly when we're talking about building flushouts, because that dictates when is the best time from an emissions perspective that we should be flushing our buildings if we want to minimize the impact on the environment. Now, for those of you who are familiar with emissions, carbon emissions, you'll know that we take an annual average in Ontario, and that's how we dictate what our carbon emission factor is for electricity. I think if you're concerned about from an environmental perspective, that doesn't really matter. It matters about the emissions at the time of using that energy source. And so we're starting to think about the time of use piece of the emissions. But getting to your answer, Philippe, sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent there. There are two things that we're looking at right now. One is piloting in we call them enhanced indoor air quality monitors. So some of the metrics we've been discussing today, the VOCs, the particulates, we're piloting 3 different technologies in the same type of spaces. We've connected it to the building automation system. We've pulled it into a dashboard. We've done all those things. Now we're trying to figure out what to do with the data. So that's always fun. Because we are doing this at buildings which are not shiny and new. Unfortunately, I don't have any of those buildings in the Ottawa portfolio. We're doing this at buildings built in the 70s and the 80s. And so integrating that into the way the building operates is a challenge, but we're getting there. We've learned that it is much more difficult, and I think a lot of people on this call probably have learned that, it's much more difficult connecting these systems than you think it's going to be. Just because they say it can connect through BACnet doesn't mean that it's going to work. So we're struggling through those kind of early days on those indoor air quality type monitoring devices. And then the other thing we're trying to do is model air quality in a space in a way that leverages the existing data that we have, and it helps to identify a risk profile. So not an index, not a number that's, let's say, a ppm, but your chance of, if you're in this space doing this activity, your chance of, let's say, getting COVID as a very basic kind of business case to be made. And then how do we share that chance of, or that risk profile with the people that are in the space, or people that may enter the space. So a couple of things we're working on, but it's all interesting, and it's all a lot more difficult than when you dream it up at the beginning, then you put the pedal to the metal and you realize it's not quite so easy.
Nothing like learning by doing.
Yeah, you got it.
If we shift gears a bit to the CF portfolio, in addition to some of the technical layer, do you have a point of view on how else we might communicate and build, let's say, occupant trust? What are some of the strategies that CF might be using to help people understand what's going on with indoor air quality?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really about engaging and educating. You know, many of our clients also tend to be large organizations themselves. So think about the big banks, for example. And so quite often these organizations themselves have health and safety teams who are very focused on the well-being of their own employees. And so often what we do is we partner with these teams to basically educate each other. So we'll learn from them and they'll learn from us. We'll share new knowledge, and we'll jointly develop goals, targets, action plans, and also communication strategies to their employees.
Excellent. And Brandon, anything else from what you've learned at BGO in terms of building trust?
I guess the only thing I've learned, which is a terrible learning, is that we haven't quite figured it out yet. I think there's a lot, like even this discussion about IAQ indices, it's what is the right amount of data? As a person that's on the operations side, sometimes I think no data is better. But as a human being, I know that that's not the right way to approach things. So what is that? What is the right data? And everything Arv says is spot on. How do you communicate? How do you engage with the tenants? Because they have their perspective on what they want to see in their spaces. And if nothing else, COVID has built that a bit of that dialogue. Certainly, we have seen questionnaires from every tenant about the quality of our filtration, and no one cared at all about filtration a year and a half ago. So the conversation has started, which is good. We have to figure out what information we need to share. We need to understand what's important to them and how much information they can absorb, and then what we are willing to, or what we have the ability to share with them.
Certainly, there's an enormous amount of work that the industry has already done to deliver good quality indoor air. to everyone and try to make it simple, but not too simple, to meet the needs of a bunch of different, ultimately, customers who are coming through the doors of our buildings. Marlene, it certainly seems to be trending as a topic over the past year, especially indoor air quality, very important. Looking ahead, if you had a crystal ball, do you see the importance being maintained? Is it going to decay once we crest through the back half of this pandemic and return to some new normal? Is it going to continue or maybe become even more important? Where do you see IAQ trending over the coming months and years?
I want to touch a little bit on what Brandon said with respect to communication with the tenants. We have been challenged by some tenants. Some tenants have partnered up with some consulting firms that are really challenging us on air quality, filtration, et cetera. So the communication, it has to be robust. What do we provide the tenants to give them the comfort level of returning to the office space? I think that is evolving, and we'll see how that kind of transpires as people return to the office space, hopefully in the fall of this year. But in my view, IAQ is only one piece of our transition here, really. We really need to see a convergence of health science and building science, in my view. Buildings, as we've said here in the panel, really affects our health, and reducing emissions and air pollution, not only outdoors but indoors, really aligns with our 2050 decarbonization strategies globally. For me, from an operations perspective, I do recommend looking at the 9 foundations of healthy buildings by a couple of Harvard professors, Joseph Allen and John Macomber. It really outlines good strategies to consider for providing a good tenant experience in a healthy building. I think that's kind of where the world is heading from a healthy IAQ perspective, and so I do recommend this book as a good read.
Thanks, Marlene. And Arv, hypothetically, we've all got these supercomputers in our pockets right now. I can well imagine at some point some super nerd is going to invent an app that'll make it easy for all of us to have IAQ in our pocket. Is there anything that we might collectively, assume that that's the case, is there anything that we might want to do now to try to get ahead of this risk, or just help people understand what they may or may not be getting in terms of valid or invalid feedback from their smartphone?
You're really giving me the tough questions here today, but it's my feeling that people will only want to have their own form of measurement if they don't trust the transparency of your measurement, right? So think about it. Why is someone going to be interested in measuring something if they already have a whole system behind them that's measuring it for them? And I mean, the reality is one single sensor is not going to give you the full picture anyways. And so the more confidence and transparency we have to our clients, the more trust they're going to have in our analysis, and less motivation that they're going to have to conduct their own measurement.
Having played around some bit with portable indoor air quality monitors and recognizing the huge tolerances around different things that we can measure, there are certainly some good value in having a systematic approach at a building level to doing this well, because those pocket sensors I think might have some challenges, at least early on. Brandon, we're getting close to time here. Thinking about the regulatory, market, even technological transformations underway, is there anything you think we should be collectively keeping a pulse on as it relates to IAQ as we look ahead?
I was speaking about those personal IAQ monitors. I was going to say that is I think Arv's right. If we can get ahead of that and we can be providing credible information, that's great. I think the fact of the matter is that those sensors are out there now. I've had one in my house for the last 2.5 years. So they exist. I don't trust it, to be honest with you, because I've put it beside other sensors and they give me different numbers. But I think that we should be ready for our tenants to be bringing these sensors to their office, because frankly, we won't be ahead of them. I'd love to say we would be, but at least in the buildings that I'm running, we are not going to be ahead of them on providing that level of data and that level of information. So we need to be ready for that. Our operations teams need to be educated on what those sensors mean, some of the challenges with those sensors, so that if someone calls them and says, hi, look at what the sensors tell me, it's saying that the indoor air quality is very poor right now, or we should get out of the space. At least we can confidently respond to that. And the response might be, well, your indoor air quality sensor was purchased from the dollar store, so perhaps you should listen to us as the experts, but at least we need to be able to engage in that conversation.
Yeah. Calibration is going to be a thing.
Yeah, 100% for sure.
So as we get closer to time here, I'm wondering if we might shift gears into a bit of a rapid fire wrap up. I'll go Marlene first, you, then Brandon, then Arv. If there was one other thing we could do to bring to the fore in Canada, the importance, be it of indoor air quality, maybe, or more broadly, health and well-being as it intersects with the built environment for which we're custodians, what do you think is the thing that we might do, be it individually or collectively as industry, to make a positive difference for health and well-being, be it through IAQ or just continued learning? Maybe Marlene first.
Well, everything that we've touched upon today, being ahead of the game, looking at IAQ beyond just the standards under ASHRAE, and looking at VOCs, radon, etc. We really need to look at it more holistically. I will also revert back to the International Code Council and the National Environmental Health Association in the US. They launched a task force in December 2020, and they're really looking at the global code requirements, existing guidelines, et cetera. They're really trying to revamp from a code perspective for buildings as being healthy to the public. And so they're focusing on really changing standards, changing guidelines so that we can mitigate threats to diseases. So it's an association certainly that we need to keep an eye on to see what comes out of that task force and how it would impact our buildings and how we're running them down the road.
Thank you, Marlene. Brandon, where do you see this going? Where can we have a positive difference?
I think about warning labels as a possible way we could get there. That's going back to something Arv had said about, is it a pass or fail? That's clearly a warning label is kind of a possible fail, but that's I see that as a way to improve the indoor air quality of a space, or at least challenge tenants and landlords to work together to improve the quality of space. But the $1 million question, and this has been discussed for a long time, is this productivity piece, and what are the important metrics that we need to be capturing, and how educated are the people that are on the receiving end of this information. I think as landlords, we have come a long way in terms of understanding what the things are that we need to measure. I'm not sure that the tenant community has caught up, and I'm not sure that we've done a terribly great job of educating the tenant and in that community, the leasing community, on what's important about indoor air quality and how to differentiate good indoor air quality space from a poor indoor air quality space.
I certainly know, as some on the call might have been familiar with the concept of 330-300, whether it's $3 a square foot for energy, 30 for facilities costs, and 300 is your employee burden cost per square foot for your knowledge workers. No question, the degree to which we can improve productivity can make a huge material impact on a financial performance of the organization. And there's more work to do to quantify what is somewhat qualitative. So you started with the idea of focusing on occupant perhaps productivity. Where do you see things going from here? How could we make a positive difference in Canada to bring the importance of indoor air quality to the fore, or other aspects of health and well-being?
Yeah, I mean, I think that indoor air quality is just one fruit in the basket of fruit that supports health and well-being of building occupants. And, we really have to be mindful of all of these aspects that continue to promote the whole basket that's essential to occupant safety. And we really have to continue to educate and engage with our clients that they have to make investments in health and well-being. And as you said, it'll pay off in employee productivity. And we talked about an indoor air quality index. I have a feeling we might be better suited with a wellness index that encompasses all of these factors, whether it's water, lighting, air, etc. But certainly air is right to the fore today because of COVID.
Arv, thank you so much. And if we could go now to our wrap-up slides. So to put a bow on this, what success looks like for this session is that you've learned a lot more about indoor air quality. And I know I certainly have. If there's 3 takeaways for me right now, it's get measuring, get involved in informed standards development, and also see what else we can do to learn about the impacts of indoor air quality on productivity. There's more to do there. And hopefully you can also commit personally to advancing your understanding of indoor air quality and applying some of the best practices we discussed today. Wanted to thank the panelists so much for their time, and you especially for the gift of your attention. I hope that you found this session to be learning and valuable, as I certainly did, and that it inspires some further learning and action. And we're not done yet. Arv, Brandon, Marlene, and I are available live in the chat room in a moment. So we wanted to thank you each very, very much once again for your time. And we wish you all the best, and we'll connect with you in a moment. Thank you.